Okay, folks, well, good evening and welcome to our virtual housing planning forum. We very much appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight for this important discussion. My name is Gerard Witten, and I'm the Executive Director with Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. I'm also a resident of the town of Newbury for over 25 years, so this is both a professional interest and a personal one for me. For those of you not familiar with our organization, we are your regional planning agency. Established in 1959 as the planning agency for the Merrimack Valley, it's our mission to promote the orderly and sustained growth across the 15 cities and towns here in northeastern Massachusetts. And that mission is carried out through our 4 program areas, which include community and economic development, the environment, geographic information systems, and transportation. And it's our community and economic development program that is spearheading the regional housing production planning effort that we'll be discussing tonight. As you'll be hearing more about in just a few minutes, economic growth and housing are directly connected and dependent on one another. So we've organized the data and content tonight to give you a broad understanding of the issues surrounding housing here in the Merrimack Valley and how what happens here in each of your respective communities has impacts across the entire region. Again, we're thrilled you've joined us this evening. So let me introduce you now to Ian Burns, who heads up MVPC's Community and Economic Development Program.
Thank you, Gerard. And I'll say thanks again to everyone who's taken time out of your busy week to join us here on this Thursday. We're thrilled to have you all here to talk about such an important topic, housing in each of our communities. As Gerard mentioned, I oversee the Community and Economic Development team here at MVPC, and he really hit the nail on the head in making the note of how inextricably linked community development housing is to economic development and how we always think about those in tandem. And we're thrilled to carry that theme forward as we talk with you all tonight about strategizing around each of your communities' housing production and what the future of housing could look like in each of your cities and towns. MVPC is thrilled to be helping each community in our 15 community region with producing a housing production plan. 5 years ago, we produced housing production plans in concert with our communities across our entire region. And here we are again updating them as most of them are due to expire within the next year. So we're thrilled about the future of the conversation we're going to have tonight. Excited to hear from all of you, and hopefully we will all leave here today learning something new and taking some new thoughts away. And so with that, I'll mention as well on our team tonight, Kayla Rennie is on our Community and Economic Development team, one of our planners. Lauren Kiesling, who you'll be hearing from shortly, also a planner on our staff. I also want to recognize the municipal staff that are joining us tonight. You'll be hearing from each of your corresponding municipal staff in the breakout sessions. And we also have folks from the Consensus Building Institute, CBI, who is here with us to help facilitate these sessions. With that, I'll hand it over to the folks at CBI to introduce themselves and orient us to how this session will run.
Thank you, Ian. Hi, good evening, everybody. It's so nice to be with you for this important conversation. I'm just going to share a couple of logistics and kind of context for how we can have a really constructive conversation together. So I'm guessing you're all pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but just a few best practices. Please just keep on mute when you're not speaking to reduce background noise. If you are comfortable using video, we love it because it makes it feel more like a face-to-face meeting. Feel free to use the chat at any time to add comments or ask questions. And if there are simple questions that we can deal with in the chat, we may just respond there, or we'll bring them in to address them verbally. We will pause at a couple of points for clarifying questions. And at that point, if you want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function, which is found in that little smiley face reactions button at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any technical challenges, please chat my colleague Abby Fulham, who's already in the chat there, giving you instructions on how to add your community after your name. That's really helpful to us for this conversation, just so we can put places to faces. So if you could add the name of your community after your name on your Zoom tile, that would be very helpful. And then just a couple of light kind of ground rules for how we talk to each other. Again, I fully expect this won't be any issue at all, knowing how these conversations have gone and how much you all are clearly invested by showing up to be here. But what I like to keep in mind is that we should assume good intentions of everyone participating here, be open to another perspective. This is a really complicated issue, and there are going to be a range of perspectives, and we can all learn some things from each other. Make space and take space. meaning both we invite you to actively contribute via hand raise or chat, as I mentioned, but also if you know you're someone who tends to comment a lot, maybe be mindful of sharing airtime with others and wait to see if somebody we haven't heard from yet wants to chime in. This one is really important to me. There is no technical expertise to participate, and no question is bad or silly to ask. And if you're wondering something, somebody else in the group might also be. So please, asking a question is a service to all of us. And as I mentioned, feel free to do that at any time in chat, and we'll pause a couple of times to take verbal questions as well. Does anybody have any qualms or needs before we jump in? All righty, I will hand it over to Lauren then. Oh, I'll just say very quickly. So first, we're going to hear just an overview of what a housing production plan is, a little bit of context about the regional housing need, and deal with some kind of demographic data to help you get a sense of sort of where we are and where we're trying to get to. Then we'll spend a good chunk of time in breakout groups specific to each community. And that's a time for you to hear about some of the recent accomplishments regarding housing in your community and hear some of the goals and potential strategies for the future. And that's where we really want you to weigh in. This is the first kind of engagement step in the process of updating these plans. So your feedback today will help your community staff flesh out that plan and come back with something more developed for a second round of community feedback later on. So we really appreciate your feedback in those sessions where there's lots of time for discussion. And then we'll return to the main session just very briefly to hear a few kind of takeaways or insights from each of those breakout discussions and be done by 7:30. Okay, now over to Lauren.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth and Ian and Gerard, for introducing this session. Welcome again, folks. My name is Lauren Kiesling, Community Planner here at the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, and I've had the utmost privilege of helping each of your 15 cities and towns kind of work through their housing production plan update in close collaboration with Kayla Rennie, our Community Economic Development Planner. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here this evening. And we're going to dive right into some information. So we're going to start here by talking about what a housing production plan is, kind of what that timeline looks like, why it is important to you and your community. And then we'll be diving into a little bit of the rationale around why increased housing production and why do we encourage production of housing of all types for all ages and income levels. And then we'll dive into a little bit of regional data so you can get the, again, Merrimack Valley scope of our housing landscape, as well as some demographic information. And then we'll dive into our breakout rooms from there. So starting with, what is a housing production plan? So at its core, a housing production plan allows communities to articulate their vision for housing production in a comprehensive plan format and identifying community-specific strategies to achieve those goals. So a housing production plan is something that came out of the Massachusetts Chapter 40B statute. It's been around for over 30 years at this point, much more. I forget that it's 2023 at sometimes, but there is the statutory component to this, which is mapping out how folks will be reaching their 10% housing stock qualifying as being eligible for their subsidized housing inventory. But there's also the arguably more important aspect of this planning process, which is providing each community with a targeted, achievable, tangible set of action strategies with how they will address their individual housing issues across our region. We do come at this from a regional standpoint, but again, we're kind of showing that dichotomy here of having us all in the same room from 6 different communities and then breaking us off into each of our individual communities, because housing, the housing crisis doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? We're seeing it across our region, but we understand that based on community income, community size, specific community needs, that these strategies are going to look different. And we want to be able to hear from you all today about what strategies you think would work best in each of your communities to help drive that growth in a way that's led by your community input that's specific for your community. So thinking about the process a little bit. So we've been embarking with each of your communities since October of 2022. And we'll be moving through this process until June of 2024, which brings us here kind of smack in the middle today to get your initial feedback on some of the strategies that have been brainstormed up by your town planning staff, as well as the stakeholder groups that we have put together to help lead this process, which consists of your select board members, affordable housing trust members, town planners, residents. We've kind of run the whole gamut in who's in those committees across our communities. So we're moving through, we're in that public engagement phase, as you can see, throughout the entirety of that process, paired with information gathering and goal development. So we're really hoping to walk away today with some concrete buy-in and suggestions for which strategies we should continue to proceed with as we look to finalize these plans. So why is there a housing shortage, and really what does all of this mean? So just for some metrics here, between 1960 and 1990, Massachusetts communities as a whole permitted almost 900,000 new housing units. And since 1990, communities have permitted fewer than 470,000 new units. And there's an estimated shortage due to this drop off in accepted building permits of 200,000 at least housing units in the state. And as you can see, as we're looking this graph on the bottom here from left to right, the 1960 through 2018, again, we don't have it through 2023, but this trend has stayed pretty much consistent. You can see those big peaks in around 1970 and then the mid 80s there, and then it kind of flattens out and continues to decrease. So because of this is why we're situated in this area where we're seeing rising housing costs due to lack of supply. We're seeing folks who are unable to find housing types that are fitting their needs. I think for us, something that we hear most often, especially across our region, is folks who are aging, senior folks who are overhoused, who are in houses that have 3 to 4 bedrooms, right? Their children have lived there, they've since left, they're now empty nesters, and folks are looking to downsize, and they're looking to downsize in the community that perhaps they grew up in, raised their children in, and would like to retire in. And we're seeing that the shortage kind of manifesting in what's called that missing middle housing gap. And as we're looking at the housing types here, this can include housing types in like duplexes, fourplexes. You've seen those, cluster townhouse styles, cottage style developments, smaller subdivisions, things of that nature. These not only are accommodating folks who are looking to downsize, but are also acting as a quote unquote starter home or a smaller size home that typically comes in at a much lower price point than some of the single family multi-bedroom homes that we're seeing majority of the housing stock, especially in our small cities and towns. So we're not only seeing this gap in who'd like to stay in the community, but we're also seeing a gap in who'd like to come in, and we're kind of stuck in the middle there. So what we're really trying to promote with some of these conversations, which we're so excited to hear your individual feedback on this tonight, of what policies can we put in place, what kind of advocacy can we put in place to continue to explore what this middle housing can look like to accommodate our residents, why we need it, and then also how we're going to get there from a regulatory standpoint. So a little bit more on just the overall rationale for why talk housing and why talk increased housing production is the community impact of housing access. So I think the thing, and especially here in the Community and Economic Development Department, constantly talking about how housing is inextricably tied to economic development and vice versa. But we have economic development first here because these are the things that we're hearing on the ground most often. So when we're thinking about even our key players, our key workers in our communities, this is ranging from firefighters, public safety, EMS, DPW workers, our teachers, our educators. I think we can all say that we've seen incomes stay relatively stagnant over the past several years, even the past several decades, whereas we've seen housing prices really skyrocket, whether it's monthly rent or mortgages, and really, the amount of down payment people might need to have behind them before they purchase a home in these areas. So to be able to support even our most crucial workers, we really need to be looking at this, again, missing middle type of housing, and looking at how we can continue to increase that production in an equitable way in order to keep those folks in our community. And I talk about this both from an equity and sustainability standpoint, as you see here. Not only is it equity in terms of everyone deserves a roof over their head, but especially folks who are looking to directly serve your communities, coming into your communities to help with economic vibrancy, cultural vibrancy, all of those aspects. We need to be able to house them appropriately so they have that opportunity. And speaking a little bit about sustainability here, we definitely, want to be pushing the narrative of housing production is not necessarily completely at odds with environmental sustainability and resistance to climate change and climate resiliency, is that we want to be moving through this development process in a way that we can see housing production occur, but also preservation of open space. And we can meet in the middle. We've seen examples of that even in our region here, and we're looking to keep moving that forward over time. And then, of course, lastly here is public health, which we saw the impacts of COVID, kind of what that looked like across the sphere. And I'll talk a little bit about COVID in a few slides. But all of these aspects are at play as we're talking about the impact of housing access. So let's dive into a little bit of data. So first, why are we taking a regional approach? I talked about it a little bit, but it not only allows us to gather information on a region-wide scale so that we're able to have region-wide interventions paired with community-specific interventions, but it also allows us to make those impactful housing decisions. And, especially I would say in clusters of small towns like the folks who are on the call tonight, there's a lot of opportunity in partnership if you're seeing the same issue. And that's something that we feel that as a regional planning agency, we're equipped to help you implement once we identify what those strategies look like. So we're really just here to help facilitate, again, these individual and region-wide goals, but it makes sense to kind of funnel it down in that fashion so that we're able to meet all the specific needs of each of our cities and towns. Diving into some data here really quick. I know data can be a make or break it for some folks. Some folks love to nerd out about it, some folks do not. So I'll spare you some of the time, but looking at our regional demographic trends, just to show you kind of who is living in our region. If you're looking at the blue bar here, you can see that our region is majority white, but close behind in that orange bar is our Hispanic and Latino population. And as we're looking at each of our communities, we have seen increased diversity over time, which yes, can be an indicator of accessible housing. Folks are looking for cultural centers and again, to increase cultural vibrancies in areas, whether it's through business opportunities or just their family is already there. But we're seeing that increased diversity, which leads to an overall diverse community, which we certainly love to see. Looking at our population projections, the Merrimack Valley as a whole is ever growing. As you can see, we had a pretty large jump between our census 2010 and census 2020 numbers. And then we kind of steadily increased over time. And it's not looking like it's going to be stopping anytime soon. But I think the positive thing here is that sure, we might be looking at a little bit of an indication of a plateau, but that's a good thing because we're able to, see who's here now, increase housing production here to accommodate the folks who are already in the region, and then leave space for our region to continue to grow from an economic development lens and just community development overall. Looking at, and you will see this in each of your individual cities and towns, but this is just from a regional standpoint, our age distribution projections. So these particular projections are through 2050, which seems awfully far away, but is less than 30 years away, if you can believe it. What I really wanted to point out here is this blue line here that lands us at 23% by 2050. I will say that these are just projections. They are not real numbers. And, there's a multitude of factors. I think the example of COVID-19 is probably a great example of things that are unexpected confounding factors in this type of data that can skew the result at the end. But just from the projection standpoint, we're looking towards almost a quarter of our Merrimack Valley population being 65 or over. And I know I talked a little bit about the need for senior housing and for downsizing for folks that we've been hearing from each of our cities and towns. I think this really speaks to the need to explore smaller housing types and accessible housing types, ranch style, first floor, to accommodate an aging demographic. And the other thing I'll point out here is in the orange bar here, that 20 to 34 years of age range, we see a pretty marked decrease over time, right? We had a small spike in 2020, but our projections are starting to look like folks are leaving the area. And I guess I can speak as a young person individually, housing prices are just far too high, far outpacing the incomes really in all age demographics in the area. And it definitely is unsurprising to us that folks may be leaving the region or are projected to leave the region due to those factors to move into a more affordable area. Looking at median household income, what I really want us to take away from this, again, it's stratified out by Merrimack Valley, Essex County as a whole, and Massachusetts as a whole. You can see that we're all pretty much on the same level here, which is great. But what I really wanted us to take away here is the purple bar here and the orange bar have a huge disparity. They're indicating a massive disparity between renter-occupied housing and owner-occupied housing. This is something that's been historic. We have seen this since pretty much, I assume, we've started collecting this data. But it's showing that, wealth generation looks vastly different between renters and owners. And what that means for your own community and what it means for people to be able to enter your community, let's say if you have majority owner occupied housing stock, and how can we kind of level that balance so that everyone has equal opportunity for wealth building over time, regardless of what type of housing situation they're in. This, I hope, is the most compelling figure that we're looking at tonight, but this is the Merrimack Valley median income rent and home value % increase over the past 20 years or so, from 2000 to 2020. So really just saying the same narrative that we've been talking about with median income and age. But as we can see, the overall median income in our region had increased 59% over the past 20 years, whereas rent and home value has increased 91% and 98% respectively. So as we can see, yes, it's not necessarily a increased twofold, but we're certainly close to that figure. And it definitely tells the story of the housing challenges cost-wise that folks are experiencing throughout our region. And this tells the story even more in depth. So this is talking about cost burden. And if you're not familiar with cost burden, the general definition is a household is paying more than 30% of their gross income towards housing. I always like to point out that gross income is before taxes, right? So this is not actually what you're bringing home. This is just what's on your paycheck before your taxes and other expenses and benefits come out. So more than 30% of that is being spent toward housing. Severely cost burdened folks are classified as more than 50% of that gross income is spent towards housing. When we're looking from a regional lens, we see that over half of all renters in our region are cost burdened, over half. That is a massive amount of folks. And it definitely speaks to, and I think as we're looking at this, the dark orange represents severely cost burden, that 50% are over, whereas the yellow represents 30% are over. We can definitely see that a lot of the folks in our region definitely do not have disposable income after paying for their household and other bills, or may even be, in more of a dire straits situation in that case. So just wanted to illuminate that and the impacts of rising housing costs and what that means long term. And if we even look at owner occupied on the bottom here, it's 1 in 4 owners are cost burdened. I think we tend to maybe, at least speaking for myself, tend to expect maybe some cost burden from renters because you're like, oh, perhaps it's someone starting out who doesn't have a lot of income to be able to, again, for that down payment for an owner occupied household. But when we're going to, who has their mortgage, who's been living in their house for a number of years, it's, housing costs include your HOA fees, your repair fees, your water bill, all of your utilities that go into keeping up a home. And we especially see that as folks age and they maybe inch towards a fixed income, they may not be able to pay those expenses, especially with ever rising property taxes. So we actually have a quarter of our homeowners throughout the region experiencing this cost burden. Just a few more slides before we break out into our rooms and answer some questions, but just wanted to give a little bit of a preview of the regional housing work in addition to this housing production plan process that's been going on in our region. Many of your communities, which I'm sure many of you sit on various boards or committees for these comprehensive plans happening in your communities. But just for a few examples, many of our communities have been undergoing master plan updates, hazard mitigation planning. I know that some folks are going through some rezoning structures as well. So this is just another tool in the toolbox to continue the great momentum that this work already has in your individual communities. And most recently, from a regional perspective, we at MVPC completed what's called the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or the CEDS, which is really a 5-year roadmap to lead to increased resilient economic development over the next 5 years. And it's timed really well because our HVPs are also on a 5-year timeline. So the CEDS actually did come away with a pretty robust housing section with some regional strategies that we're looking to use and partner with all of our communities and all of you to help implement. So you might see some repetition there, but we definitely encourage folks to come on our website and take a peek at the CEDS just for a preview of what this work can look like from a regional lens. So just a few words to help set us up for our breakout conversations is our planning context. So what's happened over the past 5 years since the last HUP was published in 2018? I've been talking a lot about COVID. COVID was definitely the heavy hitter here, right in the middle of that 5-year span, and caused a significant economic recession. And after which, in the middle of COVID, we saw historically low interest rates and housing prices. And then after COVID, coming out of that, that has since skyrocketed, right? Not only interest, but home values have absolutely exploded and rents are following the same trajectory. So again, it seems that over the past, and this has changed so quickly. So even if someone, say, was living in this region, say renting for a number of years, really after the COVID-19 recession, definitely have heard stories and anecdotes of folks' rent being raised hundreds of dollars per month, and then they're, essentially displaced from this area. So that's, a very real consequence of the pandemic that we're still trying to recover from. Each of our communities throughout the past 5 years have experienced population increase, however marginally. So it's definitely important to consider, how our new residents or returning residents really are being accommodated in terms of a mix of housing type in our respective communities. The passing and implementation of Section 3A, otherwise known as MBTA communities. I know that we received a lot of questions in this in the registration for this session tonight. Very valid. This is a legislation that impacts all 15 of the region's cities and towns, and each of our cities and towns are diligently working to identify what those districts can look like and potentially achieve compliance. I know we've been working with 8 of our communities, and I do want to encourage folks to explore this, but also treat tonight's session as kind of a kickoff to these housing conversations that you'll see in each of your individual communities as they're talking more about MBTA communities compliance. To help frame our conversations in our breakout rooms, we really want to walk away with additional strategies that your community might be considering to help increase housing production, and not necessarily that may or may not include MBTA communities, but just want to reassure folks that there are community workshops and community forums coming up and being teed up in each of your communities to talk specifically about this. So just wanted to give that caveat, but definitely it, is the state's kind of hallmark response to the housing crisis. So definitely worth mentioning. And lastly here, over the past 5 years, there's definitely been an increased awareness of the impact of housing costs on overall health, wealth building opportunity, and where people choose to live, as we've already covered. So some considerations, I promise I only have 2 slides left here, as we're talking about the feasibility of implementing some of these strategies that we'll be talking about tonight, is administrative capacity. Specifically in our small towns, we typically have a very small crew, if any at all, of one town planner, maybe 2 town planners, or none at all, to help implement these strategies. So definitely wanted to point that out, as this is something that definitely should be discussed and kept in mind as we're talking about what types of strategies are feasible in what type of timeline. The same as infrastructure capacity. I know we have heard time and time again of, increased housing production will lead to increased sewer usage and water usage, and we don't have that infrastructure. Definitely worthwhile conversation that we're looking to explore, and strategies including looking at existing sewer and water capacity could be a strategy that's included in your HVP, of saying we need to have a comprehensive study of what this capacity looks like. What will this look like when new development comes into play, et cetera. And of course, town meeting approval process. Everyone in the room tonight does have town meeting approval for the majority of major zoning changes and policy changes of that nature. And I think that you all being here tonight is a great starting place to not only be familiar with the issues that will come on the docket in the months and years to come, but also to empower yourselves and your fellow community members to make an informed decision on what you'd like to see and pass in terms of town meeting approval. Lastly, here are some examples of policy mechanisms that you may have heard of before. You'll definitely be hearing about it in your breakouts. Things including inclusionary zoning, accessory dwelling unit bylaws, affordable housing trusts, all the way to developer incentives, to waiving permit fees, expediting permitting, density bonuses. Again, lots of technical language that your municipal planners will help decode in your breakout rooms. But just wanted to give folks an idea of everything. This is just a small smattering of ideas that's on the table to help change the housing landscape in your community. So from there, I will stop sharing my screen, and I know I'm a little bit over time, but if we had time for some initial questions, I'm definitely happy to field some of those.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think we're fine for time. So folks, if you have any clarifying questions on what Lauren shared, we're also going to have plenty of time for discussion and questions in your community breakouts. So maybe the community specific questions there, but was anything unclear, or can we help you be well set up for those conversations? Any questions?
I guess one of the questions I have is, what can the state do to actually help us get some of these partnerships going? Because we've looked at partnering with private developers, but most of the housing development, including elderly housing that we've been able to attract to our town, has not helped with our 40B because the developers would rather make high-end housing. And so the incentives from the state, there's a stick, but there's no incentives that I'm aware of.
No, that's a great question, Damon. And thank you for asking it. It's something that we're constantly asking ourselves here at the Regional Planning Commission as well, especially as an agency that relies on grant funding, majority from the state to keep going. But this is something that the state is definitely looking at. I know that we heard from some of our state legislators at a conference earlier this week that there's historic housing bills kind of coming down the pipeline. But a good example of this is the One Stop for Growth application process. The state essentially combined a plethora of planning assistance grants into one main application. And that's something that I know has simplified that process of accessing funds and support for our communities and for ourselves here at your regional planning agency. But it really does, right? At the end of the day, I think, come down to funding and the implications of that funding. But the other thing that I'll mention is that agencies like ourselves, not necessarily to position ourselves as your main implementation partner, but just to say it thematically, that's kind of the role that we're looking to back into, is helping implement some of these things and form these partnerships. I think a partnership with your local RPA is a starting point, just to have a mouthpiece to the state to be able to talk about your various needs, especially from a small town environment, to help, be able to lobby for some additional funding and technical support coming down the pike. But those are my initial thoughts. I don't know if other folks from MVPC would like to dive in, as I'm sure we could say a lot more about this as well.
Just to comment on one of the questions in the chat about the population projections. Thank you, Paul, for that question. It's based off of the every 10-year census, so we don't have an update right now with actual 2023 numbers based off of the trend for the projections. We do tend to look at the 5-year American Community Survey data, which comes from the U.S. Census Bureau. So around 2025, we could look at where those projections are tracking, but we don't have an update from this year based off of the projections.
Tim from Newbury, or Tim Newbury.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together. You did mention infrastructure, but one of the other key ingredients in the infrastructure is schools. The state does not properly fund our transportation school budget today, hasn't done it since they built Triton. So what is the state going to do when they want us to increase homes, add more students to the population, and not pay for the funding of the school? So how can we rectify that situation?
That's a great question about the.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That's a fantastic question. And so one of the things that we talk about when we think about adding housing and the impacts on its school system is thinking about what type of housing we're looking to add. A lot of what we were just talking about and that we'll talk about in your breakout sessions is that some of the mismatch we see in the lack of housing are those smaller units that Lauren was referencing, typically 1-2 bedroom units, sometimes 3-bedroom units. And more often than not, we see that an increase in housing production, especially of multifamily housing, doesn't have necessarily drastic impacts on school enrollment. We've been tracking this and studying this pretty regularly. And across pretty much every school district, there isn't much of a correlation there. However, that being said, you're absolutely right to be concerned about the state funding that will come down the pipeline for any new students. And we're always talking with our partners about that. Unfortunately, we don't control the funding the state gives you. But one of the things that they have been looking at is how that formula is distributed by town, especially when new residents come in. So it's something that we want to put as part of your plan as a whole to consider, because if you have new families, you'll have new students. What I will say is that sometimes the studies surprise us in how housing actually does impact school enrollment on the ground.
Thanks for the question, Tim. We probably have time for one more, and then I want to not shortchange our community discussion. So
I have something to say. This is Susan Imbriano from Rowley. I will tell you something now. Presently in Linfield, they have the 40Bs. They got a new school system, and what happened now, they've already outpaced with the new people that moved in the school system. So now they have to build an additional school. And you know who they went to? the taxpayer. They said the taxpayer is going to have to take it. And they had an override of 2.5. How much should the taxpayer take? How much can we pay?
Susan,
In the end, who's paying for this but the taxpayers?
thanks for the comment, Susan. And do, you know, as MVPC mentioned, please, you know, raise those considerations around infrastructure and funding in your community conversation. And thank you. Brett, did you want to chime in? And then we'll go to breakouts.
Yeah, my question is around, I see in the slide deck at the top about 40B. You know, I haven't followed 40B as closely as a lot of other people, at least in Newbury and other towns, but certainly when you Google it, 40B is everywhere. And so I'm curious about the bullet point about how an HPP could, you know, help communities with further control over 40B, but also what the opportunities are for engaging with the state to request or push them to provide, you know, tighter guidance on how the program can work, and, you know, tighter metrics around, you know, what could be approved or what shouldn't be approved. Because a lot of what I've kind of gathered from a distance is there tends to be a lot of vague and gray in that program, and it allows sometimes developers to really push the line where I don't think that was intended.
Yeah, great question, Brett. I'll just quickly answer really the top part of your question. HEPs, so if communities have an approved, which means they've gained local approval from the select board in this case, and then also from the state, they're able to, for a, approved 5-year housing production plan, it gives you one aspect of kind of a 2-part system that gives you further control over 40Bs. The second part is that you have your approved HUP, and then your community is also increasing their affordable housing stock by 0.5 to 1.0% per year. That's also a production schedule that we do provide based on your existing SHI numbers in the HUP itself. But when you have both of those things on board, you can become what is called having a certified HUP. So your HUP becomes certified if you're reaching those production minimums. And then if you have that on board, it gives you about 1 year to 2 years of cushion for your ZBA to deny a comprehensive permit related to 40B development coming into your area. So it's not necessarily the whole 5-year buffer. You do have to recertify every 1 to 2 years, depending on how many units you've brought online that are on the SHI, but that's kind of how the HUP helps with that process and gives more community control of whether to say yes or no to a 40B, or perhaps pursue a friendly 40B agreement where you're able to choose where that goes, etc.
Thanks, Brett. I think hopefully everybody benefited from that. I did not know all of those details, so certainly helpful. Okay, so we're going to move to community breakouts right now. And again, you'll get to hear from your municipal staff who will share some of what's been happening on housing, where we're going from here, get some feedback from you. And we'll come back into the plenary at 7:20 to just hear a quick harvest from everybody's discussion and wrap up. Sorry for the abrupt yanking from whatever conversation you were in. But thanks so much for your engagement in all those spaces. We have just a few minutes now to hear a couple of quick takeaways from each of those conversations, wrap up from MVPC about kind of next steps and where we're going from here. Gerard, did you want to recognize anybody in the room?
Yeah, let me just jump in and welcome Senator Tarr. Senator Tarr, do you want to greet the entire audience here?
Well, thank you, Gerard. Thank you for doing this. I think it's a really important conversation, and I think having the conversation regionally is so important, as opposed to having communities struggle with this issue on their own. So I appreciate you convening us. Within the limits of my limited technical capability, I tried to jump between some of the breakout rooms. I apologize that I didn't make it to all of them, but happy to hear the discussions. I've heard some common themes so far, particularly around inclusionary zoning and accessory dwelling units, certainly important subjects. And I think there may be room to explore in the future some more zoning tools like cluster zoning and transferable development rights, which may take us to another level. And maybe we could have more of a discussion about that at some point in the future. But for right now, just thank you, Gerard, for allowing me to share a few thoughts, and thank you for doing this.
Senator, we're thrilled you joined us this evening, and we have a lot of creative folks with some great ideas, and we will certainly follow up with you and keep you apprised as our process continues. And again, thank you for joining us and for your support.
Excellent. Okay, could we just do a quick lightning round, hearing from the municipal staff, any ideas that really rose up in discussion? Maybe we can start with Boxford and then go to Merrimack.
Yeah, I'm gonna hop in. I know Ross and I chatted and had a great breakout discussion. I'll just give a few quick highlights. One of the main topics we talked about was ADUs, accessory dwelling units. And so there was some good support in our breakout group for bringing that forward in Boxford to hopefully have rental units allowed and not just for family units for ADUs in town. There was also a lot of discussion about creating more affordable housing in town, since there is a relative lack of affordable units in the community, and how can we create more affordable units. We also talked a little bit about how we can strategize using the MBTA communities legislation to produce more of those 1, 2, even 3-bedroom units to allow folks to downsize out of their current homes, because there is a little bit of a mismatch where we have folks not able to downsize in Boxford. There was also the highlight of the tax burden of senior residents in town and how they can continue to afford to live in their house and pay the taxes in the community. That's a brief highlight of what we talked about. Great discussion in Boxford, and I'll hand it over to the next community.
Thank you, Ian. Let's go to Merrimack and have Newbury on deck.
Merrimack had some of the same thoughts where we focused, that we do have seniors who it's very difficult to downsize within town based on the housing costs. We also talked about infrastructure capacity and what obstacles does that place on the town as we look at putting in new housing and not having the capacity to deal with that. And then really just, I think, talked about zoning and how do we look at zoning in order to create a way for there to be other than single family housing or over 55, which is what we see, but other types of housing, diversified housing, and how do we incentivize that to happen?
Thank you so much. Newbury, and then we'll turn to Georgetown.
I probably did too much talking, so I want to ask someone else to give an overview, but and in the interest of time, we definitely touched on topics that were brought up in the slides, concerns about our infrastructure, in particular sewer and water supply, just the limitations there, and how do we really address those? We've been talking about them for a long time, but how do we move forward? We talked about a concern about costs, impact on schools, and how do we advocate at the state level for help, whether that's incentives for private developers or support. We talked about how there are a lot of programs in terms of technical assistance for communities. So and then finally, I'll say, at least I really thank everyone who attended and feel like there is interest in this. So maybe it's time for Newbury to really look at developing an affordable housing committee, or just a more active way that these kinds of conversations can carry forward in support of the work that the staff and the planning board and the select board and all the other committees and boards are doing. But how do we focus on this issue in a discrete way? Because there may be some things that we haven't been able to access yet. So
thank you so much, Kristen. Great to hear. Let's go to Georgetown and then Rowley.
Hi, everyone. So I was in the Georgetown group. I don't know if I should maybe pass it over to Tim. He gave a great overview of some of the recent housing accomplishments for Georgetown. So Tim, if you want to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no problem. So we talked about some of the concerns with the senior population projections, and how we do have a shortfall of units, certain age group. But then we just talked about some of our accomplishments in getting additional funding from our CPC that allowed us to purchase additional units and have a little bit of the assets right now to continue to buy units, put deed writers on them, and then resell them. We're in the process of doing 2 of those units right now. And then we just reviewed some of our other accomplishments over the last year and a half or so.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to hear. Let's go to Rowley, and then last but not least, West Newbury.
Sure, I can speak for Raleigh. We had a very robust discussion, and I definitely learned a lot in our session. So a few things I'll point out. We had a good discussion around ADUs amongst many other topics, but two main things I wanted to put out into the audience here was that we've been hearing, I think, from some of the senior aging population in Raleigh that they may be interested in adding an ADU, but there are two main barriers to that. The first being when you do add an ADU to your property, there is a fear of an increase in property tax and not being able to meet that need, even if it's offset with the rental of that ADU. And in addition, if you are looking at adding an ADU, that you need to bring your entire property up to code. And a lot of folks don't have that, it's financially infeasible or don't have that disposable income to make that happen in adding an ADU. So that definitely was new information for me. And I think that would resonate, I think, with a lot of other folks on the call. We also, like many other communities, had concerns about, people wanting to downsize as they age and stay in the community, and a strong sense of community attachment. So really, really feeling adamant about staying in Raleigh as they deserve to do, as well as folks wanting to re-enter the community, maybe post-college or since moving away, but are unable to due to, again, housing affordability and just housing type. And lastly, this term was coined by one of Raleigh's community members, but making practically affordable units, not necessarily just saying, we want to increase affordability, but practically affordable specifically for the incomes that we're seeing in Raleigh. And that can be supported on the incomes we also see in, town-based services, et cetera, but making practically affordable units a priority as we're working with developers.
Great to hear. All right, Sue from West Newbury.
I'll wrap it up. So we talked about many of the things that you all talked about as well. We also talked about having a good communication strategy when you bring forth things to town meeting. I'm very conscious of that, getting ready to bring the ADU bylaw to town meeting, and then, the MBTA communities in the spring. So I think that was a great discussion. We also talked about seeking out a friendly 40B. We talked about how we could get a partner that generally needs, a certain number of units, and the possibility of splitting, finding a couple sites that so we could not have one large unit, but one large project, but, maybe spread it around town a little bit. We also, talked about concerns about overburdening some of our assets, as has often been said. I want to keep it short. I want to give you time to wrap up, but if anyone else that was in the West Newbury chat room wants to add anything, happy to have you do so.
Maybe if you'd like to add anything, feel free to pop it in the chat. And I'll turn it to Lauren to close. Thank you all so much.
I do have a closing slide, but we're probably tired of seeing slides at this juncture, so I'll just say it verbally. I can't thank you all enough for spending the evening with us. This was extremely valuable on a multitude of levels, and definitely excited to see how we can start to incorporate your feedback and ideas into our draft plans. But really what's next up, in addition to incorporating your feedback, is we will be doing a round of in-person public meetings for each community here tonight on an individual basis. So this conversation has not stopped in terms of just under our housing production plan bubble, but overall in your communities. We're looking forward to hopefully seeing you all in person throughout the winter. We're working on scheduling those workshops now, but to continue these conversations and also to make sure when we present to you a draft strategy list that we heard you appropriately in tonight's session. So we'll be able to do that quality check and then also have more conversations around your concerns and aspirations for your communities. And we definitely encourage folks, again, as we mentioned in the regional presentation, there are a lot of concurrent planning efforts happening, whether it's MBTA communities, zoning changes, master planning, et cetera. We strongly encourage you to attend those other public forums and workshops and surveys and all of the good stuff, because these plans don't really mean much unless they're guided by our community members. And so we very, very much cannot understate how much we appreciate your participation and dedication to your community. So thank you so much. Keep an ear out for your in-person session date in a few months, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
You have a great evening.
Thank you, Senator Tar, for joining us.
Thank you, Planning Commission.
Thank you.